During the early 20th century, the Japanese Navy made a habit of interesting ship designs, from trying to abuse treaty loopholes to interesting cruisers. Sometimes these were innovative and set a pattern for other navies to follow. For example, the Fubuki-class. And sometimes these ended up as total failures, like Ryujo. And then there was Oyodo, a ship that began her life as a submarine command ship, only to enter service when that role was no longer necessary, at which point she was rebuilt into the Flagship for the entire combined fleet. A temporary role as it turned out, but one that shows how weird things were for this cruiser. Her design was a unique one, to say the least. How successful is something of an open question. Let's look at that in this video, beginning, of course, with her construction. That began on February 14th, 1941, in Kure. Oyodo was laid down on that day, with her construction progressing at a fairly average pace. The cruiser would launch on April 2nd of 1942. At this point, the Japanese were at the height of their successes. The carriers were soon to launch the Indian Ocean raid, further cementing Japanese ascendance. For a time, anyway. By the point Oyodo finished her fitting out and commissioned, the situation had changed completely. The cruiser joined the Japanese fleet on February 28, 1943, after Midway and the battles off Guadalcanal. You can probably see why the initial submarine support role was no longer necessary. By the time this ship entered service, the Japanese needed cruisers to be cruisers, not to lead submarines. So with that in mind, how useful was Oyodo as a traditional cruiser? Well, let's look at that now. Displacing around 8,300 tons at the standard load, this was a fairly average cruiser. Her displacement only rose to 11,616 at the full loading. This was, admittedly, still larger than the Agano class that Oyodo was based on. That displacement allowed for 2 triple turrets, each carrying 3 155mm or 6.1-inch guns, for a total of 6 barrels in all. Those turrets were carried in a super-firing pair mounted on the bow, and were actually surplus mountings from the conversion of the Mogami-class cruisers. This lent Oyodo a normal-looking superstructure until you reach the funnel. But we'll get back to that in a second. Before that, the remaining weaponry was rounded off by 4 twin 100mm mounts. The best dual-purpose weapons the Japanese had, which are more commonly associated with the Akizuki-class. These were, in turn, backed up by a spread of 25mm guns. The exact number varying, of course, on when in the war you're talking about. As designed, it was 6 triple mounts for 18 barrels. In a departure from typical Japanese design, Oyodo did not carry any torpedoes. The reason for which is obvious when you go past the funnel, because at that point, you reach the rather large hangar. You see, the intention as a submarine command ship was pretty simple. Oyodo would carry 6 high-speed floatplanes, which would be used for scouting. As the theory went, you had a fast cruiser with fast scouts. Those aircraft would find targets for the submarine, whereupon the cruiser, fitted with extensive communication facilities, would route the submarines to the target. It's not a terrible idea in concept. Regardless of how effective it would have been, it did heavily impact Oyodo's design. It's why the cruiser looks like an Agano up until you reach the funnel. And then you hit the hangar. The space this took up, along with the catapult on the stern, made it impossible to carry aft turrets, or torpedoes. This would have made Oyodo of dubious utility as a standard cruiser. She had no weaponry to the stern, and no torpedoes to make up for it. Even the armor protection left something to be desired. Following the Agano pattern, this was very thin, a maximum of 60mm or 2.4 inches on the belt. with a deck that ranged from 30 to 50 millimeters, 1.2 to 2 inches. That said, the cruiser did not lack in speed. Oyodo could manage 35 knots on 110,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts in this case. And with that, we finish the design detail. A bit longer than usual, but this is a unique ship, with, as it turned out, a mostly quiet career. This shouldn't really be surprising. Oyodo was commissioned in February of 1943, which meant she could have been used in the Solomons. However, as said, the ship wasn't really fit for surface action. The Japanese were well aware of this and didn't risk her in that role. Instead, they kept the ship close to home, where Oyodo would work up into April of 1943. In fact, even her first theoretical action was nowhere near the hotspots of the war. Oyodo was assigned to the Mobile Force in May of 1943. Her first mission as part of that group was to sail north. American forces had begun the liberation of Attu in the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese, for their part, assembled a force to contest those landings. Oyodo joined that force on May 22, 1943, only for the operation to be cancelled before it ever began, as Attu fell back into American hands. At that point, Oyodo would return to quiet duty. In fact, for the rest of 1943, very little of note happened. She remained around Japan until July 9th, at which point the cruiser set out for Truk, as part of a troop transport run in this case. While American submarines attempted to attack the group at multiple points, only one of them got off torpedoes, which missed. Oyodo would arrive safely in Truk by July 15th, and then depart once more on July 19th to sail down to Rabaul. This also proved uneventful, with the cruiser arriving on July 21st, before promptly turning around and returning to Truk. For the rest of 1943, Oyodo would mostly remain around that island, with 2 exceptions, once in September and the other in October. On September 19th, she departed for Eniwetok. Oyodo joined up with the main Japanese fleet in response to raids on Tarawa and Macon. However, this ended up coming to nothing. The Japanese fleet did not make contact with the Americans, and Oyodo would return to Truk by September 25th, where she would remain until October 17th, where the Japanese once more sortied to Eniwetok in response to more potential American raids, this time on Wake Island. Oyodo and the others arrived on October 19th before departing on October 23rd. Only 2, once again, find no American forces. You are probably seeing a pattern here of Oyodo missing a chance at any action. Regardless, the cruiser would return back to Truk on October 26th, and she wouldn't leave again until the end of the year, specifically December 30th. That day saw her depart on a transport run, this time to New Ireland. The run itself would pass without issue, a slight delay in unloading the supplies aside. However, after leaving New Ireland on January 1st, 1944, Oyodo came under air attack. Aircraft from USS Bunker Hill and USS Monterey descended upon her. Fortunately for the cruiser, her luck would hold out. Oyodo was hit by one dud bomb and lightly damaged by near misses. The damage was minor enough, in fact, that she could take a torpedoed freighter in tow the very next day. After that, 2 things of note occurred. First, another uneventful transport run, this time to Saipan on February 16th. That concluded on the 22nd, at which point Oyodo turned home, specifically all the way back to Japan, where she arrived on February 26th, for a refit into Flagship duty. And not just normal duty, but Flagship for the entire combined fleet, as I mentioned earlier. This refit ran from March 6, 1944 to March 31st. The most notable changes were a shorter catapult for 2 floatplanes. and her hangar, never having received its intended aircraft, was converted, in this case to living quarters for the crew, as the original crew quarters were given over to staff personnel. Oyodo also received more 25mm guns, 6 triple mounts and 11 singles, bringing the total barrels to 47. These were matched by a new surface search radar, a Type 22 model as well. When this refit was complete, Oyodo would remain in Japan. She sailed between moorings for much of 1944, but never departed Japanese home waters. In her role as fleet command ship, that was perfectly fine. It was more admin duty than actual combat duty, so there was little reason to leave home. The most excitement the cruiser saw during this period was a trip around Japan on October 11, 1944. On that voyage, a submarine attempted to torpedo the group Oyodo was part of. 6 torpedoes were fired, all of which missed the cruiser. One of them, however, slammed into the bow of the destroyer Fubuki. The destroyer would limp home, while Oyodo escaped without damage. And a few days later, she would finally depart Japan. On October 20th, Oyodo joined up with the Northern Force for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. She would take up an escort position for the battle carriers Hyuga and Ise. 5 days later, Oyodo would see her first real battle, that being the Battle of Cape Engano on October 25th. The series of air attacks directed at the Japanese fleet proved devastating. From Zuikaku down to Akizuki, the Japanese fleet was battered. Oyodo wouldn't escape damage either. She would receive 2 near misses and 1 bomb that damaged a boiler room, as well as 2 rockets and another near miss later on. This was relatively minor damage, all things considered. Oyodo was able to pull alongside Zuikaku and take Admiral Ozawa off. Now taking up flagship duty, the cruiser withdrew with other surviving Japanese ships. After escaping the battle, Ozawa transferred his flag to Hyuga on October 27th. Oyodo, for her part, was sent on a transport run to Manila on October 29th. Nothing of major note happened on this trip, with the cruiser moving on by November 4th. First to Brunei, where she joined up with other Japanese ships, notably Haruna, Haguro, and Ashigara. Oyodo remained with that group until December 12th, at which point she joined Ashigara, sailing for French Indochina on December 12th, where the cruiser would remain until December 24th. On that day, she left with Ashigara and assorted destroyers to bombard Mindoro. This did not go well. American air attacks began almost immediately on December 26th. Several of the ships were damaged by this, including Oyodo, another near miss, and slight damage from a 500-pound bomb. The actual bombardment didn't go terribly, but it also didn't do much in the long run. Oyodo would be back in French Indochina by December 28th, with very little to show for her effort. And with the coming of the new year, she sailed south, specifically to Singapore, arriving there on January 1st, 1945, where the lingering damage from all those air attacks was repaired. That refit lasted from January 9th through to January 29th of 1945. Upon its conclusion, Oyodo made another transport run. In company with Ise and Hyuga, she sailed north. This voyage would last until late February and see quite a number of submarine attacks. Combined fleet cites 23 in all, and every single one failed to land a single hit, which is almost impressive this late in the war. In any event, Oyodo arrived back in Japan on February 20th. She would never leave again. The cruiser was moored in Kure on March 1st and given over to training duty. That should not have been an issue. But on March 19th, the first major American air raid arrived. Oyodo's luck would finally run out. 3 500-pound bombs slammed into the cruiser, coupled with multiple near misses. The first bomb hit the port engine room, starting a massive fire. The second hit the base of her funnel, and the third hit the starboard side, before exploding inside the cruiser. The combination of these hits and the near misses caused a heavy list. They did not, however, sink the ship. Oyodo had to be beached, but the cruiser was still patched up enough to be refloated and put in dry dock on March 23rd. While this would fix her hull, 4 boilers and much of the anti-aircraft guns just couldn't be replaced. Nonetheless, the refit was concluded on May 4th. Unfortunately for Oyodo, this did little good. She remained in port off Etajima until another American air raid came on July 24th. This saw the ship hit by 5 500-pound bombs, which caused a list to starboard. A follow-up raid on July 28th sealed her fate. Oyodo was hit once again, and this time the damage was too severe to fix. She capsized to starboard and was left in place. To add insult to injury, an American aircraft put 2 rockets into the capsized cruiser later that day. Between the 2 attacks, 223 of her crew were killed and 180 were injured. As for the ship herself, Oyodo was left in place. The hulk was only salvaged on September 20th of 1947, where the cruiser was brought upright and towed into a dry dock, and then scrapped in place between January and August of 1948. Certainly not the most exciting career, to say the least. But I think Oyodo is still an interesting ship, in both design and in her story. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.